To get started with the session, I now call upon our first speaker, Dr. Rishikesh May, to please unmute himself and switch on the camera. Over to Dr. Rishikesh.
Good morning, everyone, on the esteemed panel. Am I audible?
Yes, doctor.
Okay, so I'll share my screen.
Yes.
Good morning. Good morning to all the judges.
Shall I start?
Yes, doctor.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Rishikesh, and the topic of my presentation is treatment outcomes in childhood ocular myasthenia. No financial interest in products which perhaps might be shown. Myasthenia gravis in children is less common than in adults. It is almost 35% myasthenia in children usually remains ocular. The present study is aimed at evaluating the outcomes of medical treatment in childhood ocular myasthenia. It was a prospective analysis of childhood ocular myasthenia presenting in 1 year from January to December 2017. The inclusion criteria was children less than 16 years and follow-up of more than 6 months. We did clinical, serological, electrophysiological, and radiological investigations for all these patients. And all patients were started on medical treatment and reviewed for remittance, recurrence, and generalized progression. We had included 8 cases out of between age group 6 to 15 years, male preponderance. Almost all cases had bilateral acquired ptosis, but diplopia was not present in any of the patients. Diurnal variation was present in 5, Cogan's slit twitch in 3. More important is that the positive neostigmine test was present in 7 out of one patient had, the result was not equivocal. So also we tested for thymoma, which was not seen in any of the cases on chest CT. Just a patient whom we performed the ice pack test, which showed significant improvement after 25 seconds of applying the ice pack itself. All cases were managed with oral pyridostigmine and steroids over next 3 months, and they were depending upon their result. The medical treatment was tapered over the next 3 months. The follow-up was monthly during the treatment and 2 monthly after stopping the treatment for 2 years. The findings were noted mainly for improvement of ptosis and improvement in ophthalmoplegia. The results, some patients, some remission after commencement of treatment was seen in all cases. Some amount of remission, not complete, although 4 cases showed complete remission in the first month and rest over the next 2 months. A recurrence on stopping the treatment was seen in only 2 cases at 6 months and 11 months. They were restarted on treatment. One patient has improved, but one is still on treatment. There is no cases of generalized myasthenia in any of the cases. Another patient whom after 3 months of treatment showed total improvement in ptosis and ophthalmoplegia. And also the patient who had incomplete improvement after the initiation of treatment 2 weeks after starting the treatment. So in discussion, it's mainly male preponderance has been seen in this study, unlike the previous studies. Generalized myasthenia in 15% of other, as compared to other studies. Pyridostigmine alone may not be sufficient for remission, and oral steroid has been recommended in literature as well. So 75% remission in the present study is seen compared to 60% as described by other studies. So to conclude, ocular myasthenia in children usually presents with ptosis and ophthalmoplegia of varying degrees. Oral pyridostigmine with steroid helps in remission of these conditions, and early medical treatment helps in remission and avoids chances of recurrence and generalized progression of myasthenia. Thank you.
I think we can invite the next
Hello.
speaker if no one has any other questions to ask.
Okay, doctor.
Thank you.
Just a moment.
I shall stop, sir. Share.
Yes, doctor, please. I now call upon our next speaker, Dr. Ramunji Samantha. Dr. Ramunji Samantha, please switch on your camera.
Yeah.
Yes, over to you.
Are my slides visible?
Yes, doctor. And you're audible too.
Good morning. So my topic is etiology and characteristic of optic disc edema in a tertiary care center in India. So optic disc edema can be a vital manifestation of varied ocular as well as systemic disorders. Some of them are relatively benign, while others may have devastating visual and neurological consequences. Ophthalmologist may be the first person whom a patient with disc edema may consult. Thus, ophthalmologists must be aware how to differentiate among the varied etiologies based on the history and clinical features. OCT is an in vivo quantitative and objective measure that can detect, characterize, and monitor axonal swelling associated with disc edema. However, there are paucity of studies in the literature involving clinico-demographic profile and OCT characteristics of various categories of disc edema. So our purpose was to assess the various etiologies of the disc edema at our institute and to evaluate the retinal nerve fiber layer thickness in varied etiologies and to look for any possible correlation between the clinical severity of disc edema and RNFL thickness. So it was a hospital-based retrospective observational study from January to December 2019. All patients with unilateral or bilateral disc edema presenting to OPD of our institute was included. Pseudopapilledema was excluded. Demographic data and clinical history were noted for all patients. Each patient underwent comprehensive ocular examination, and disc edema was categorized according to the modified Friesen criteria and further subcategorized into mild, moderate, and severe for statistical analysis. RNFL thickness was measured by spectral domain OCT. The average RNFL thickness and those of the four principal quadrants were analyzed. Appropriate statistical tests were employed. So these are the basic results which showing comparative demographic features of various etiologies. We can see there are broad categories of vascular papillopathy which included diabetic and hypertensive papillopathy, uveitic group, disc edema secondary to retinal vascular occlusion, idiopathic intracranial hypertension, papilledema, AION, demyelinating optic neuropathy, toxic optic neuritis, and compressive optic neuropathy. So there were total 64 eyes, and majority belong to the vascular papillopathy and uveitic group, followed by RVO and IIH group. There was male preponderance in the vascular papillopathy, uveitic, and RVO group. The rest had female preponderance. In the mean age of presentation, we can see that the minimum least age of presentation with the toxic optic neuropathy group and highest mean age of presentation was with the AION group. The vascular papillopathy group, idiopathic intracranial hypertension and papilledema all had bilateral presentation, whereas RVO had unilateral presentation, all of them, and rest of them had either unilateral or bilateral presentation. As regard to the best corrected visual acuity, the idiopathic intracranial hypertension group had the best corrected visual acuity, best presenting visual acuity, whereas the optic neuritis group has the worst presenting visual acuity. And these are the group which shows the initial diagnosis made by the ophthalmologist, neurologist, general physician, or the physician. So this table shows the symptomatology and ophthalmic clinical characteristic in different categories of disc edema. The symptom duration was maximum before presentation with papilledema and minimum in case of the anti-ischemic optic neuropathy. So these are the different representations of the mild, moderate, and severe disc edema in the various categories and associated fundus features in various categories. So although it's a busy table, the main thing is that there are RNFL thickness in various quadrants. This is inferior, superior, nasal, temporal, and mean RNFL thickness in various subcategories. We can see that the mean RNFL thickness is highest in case of the uveitic group, closely followed by compressive optic neuropathy group. And all of these groups followed the double hump RNFL pattern, that is inferior more than superior and nasal more than temporal in all categories except the uveitic compressive categories.
Sorry to interrupt you, doctor. Your time is up.
So this table shows that the RNFL thickness in all quadrants, so which showed a positive correlation in with respect.
Time's up. Please conclude.
So our limitation was this has a relatively small sample size and retrospective nature and not age-matched control vector. So to conclude, the study provides a baseline demographic profile and RNFL measurements. The clinical severity of disc edema correlated positively with RNFL thickness, and most categories of disc edema followed normative pattern of RNFL thickness despite thickening. And these values may serve as a yardstick for quantitative categorization and may be designed in future studies to validate our initial observations. Thank you.
Thank you, doctor. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, I have one. He has to unshare his screen. Stop sharing the screen.
Okay.
Stop sharing the screen. I think I have a question. He has to stop sharing his screen. Yeah, that's it. Ramanu, that's a nice overview of demographic profile. Obviously, you need more number of patients, but how is this quantification or RNFL thickness alone going to help you in maybe shortlisting what is a causative agent, unless you do other ancillary tests along with it, because disc edema, papilla edema, everything will have an increase in RNFL thickness.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. The main purpose was to see what is the pattern of RNFL swelling and the double hump RNFL pattern that is followed. So as you have pointed out, sir, we cannot say categorically this much of swelling points to this category. So that will not help us, but we wanted to see the pattern of thickening which is present in, but except the compressive and uveitic, which can be explained by the fact that suppose in uveitic group that will be adjacent to the structures involved, retinochoroidal in superior quadrant, so that is expected to involve the superior RNFL thickening.
Yeah, so you have other features like inflammation and all in the uveitis group. Plus, you should do a ganglion cell analysis along with that, because that is usually a more sensitive indicator of things like you had you said with the vision the vision did not recover in patients with optic neuritis. I mean, that why isn't it recovering? Because with modern treatments, usually this doesn't happen. So everything has to be correlated. Otherwise, yeah, obviously go on. I mean, you have when you do more patients, probably you'll have better answers. Nice presentation.
Dr. Samanta, Dr. Vikas here from PJ
Yes,
Lucknow.
Yeah.
You have shown that AIN were 5 cases, na?
Yes, sir.
Arthritic ischemic optic neuropathy.
Yes, sir.
And the age group was 48 plus minus 2.
Yes, sir.
So what were the causes for that AIN? Because usually it should be more than 60. Because
Yes,
can
sir.
you elaborate the causes?
And actually, this is a referral bias also. And as our presenting draining area, majority of the patients had younger age group. So most of the times, the older age group being neglected and they do not present to the.
So we are done with the question and answers session. Can we go to our next speaker?
Yes, next speaker can.
Okay. Now I introduce to the next speaker, Dr. Priyanka Mandara, to please unmute herself and start the presentation. Over to you, doctor.
Yes, I am audible. Yes, I am audible.
Yes, doctor.
Okay, I am sharing my screen.
Yes.
It is visible.
Yes, doctor, it's visible.
Hello. Good morning. I'm audible.
Yes, doctor.
Good morning to all of you. Topic of my presentation today is OCT analysis of RNFL and GCL thickness in non-glaucomatous optic neuropathies. Introduction. Non-glaucomatous optic neuropathy was defined as a clinical evidence of impaired optic nerve function in absence of field or discharges of glaucoma. Etiological groupings were determined as inflammatory, ischemic, toxic, nutritional optic neuropathy, and papilledema. A pale disease characteristic of a long-standing optic neuropathy. Optic atrophy is the end result of any disease that damages nerve anywhere between the retinal ganglion cells and the lateral geniculate body. The OCT is a non-invasive ocular imaging technique that uses low coherence interferometry to generate in vivo high resolution within 10 micron cross-sectional images of RNFL by measuring backscatter of infrared light. The measurement of RNFL can be an objective measurement of a nerve swelling or nerve atrophy by analyzing the ganglion cell complex. OCT can help to detect early axonal damage and may predict the visual outcome. My aim of study is to evaluate RNFL and GCL thickness in the patients with the non-glaucomatous optic neuropathy. My study design was cross-sectional observational study conducted in my department. Inclusion criteria was patient with optic neuropathies other than glaucoma, included age group 18 to 65 years. Exclusion criteria was anemia opacity, consecutive optic neuropathy, and excluding the age group less than 18 years and more than 65 years. Sample size was 51 eyes of 40 patients diagnosed as NGN was compared with a healthy fellow eyes. Based on the fundus examination, NGO grouped as dyskidema, dysphalar, and normal technical. The study duration was 7 months. Here are the results. The demographic profile of the patients with the NGO showed male dominance with a mean age of 26 to 35 years in dyskidema, 51 to 60 years in dysphalar. The mean average RNFL thickness in dyskidema, dysphalar, and fellow eyes were 225, 67, and 91. Average RNFL thickness mean in dyskidema, dysphalar, and fellow eyes was 67, 63, and 82. The statistical analysis was done by unpaired t-test. Here is the diagram. Here is the picture showing the right eye dyskidema. Their overall thickness is increased and GCL is decreased. Here another scan of OCT of right dysphalar showing the both RNFL as well as GCL thinning. Discussion: the average RNFL thickness was raised in dyskidema and decreased in dysphalar significantly. Henderson et al. Observed the raised RNFL thickness in acute optic neuritis and thinning of RNFL with a long duration. Between the RNFL and GCL thinning, toxic neuropathy, average RNFL thickness was significantly weak.
Doctor, you're not audible.
I'm audible or not?
Yes, doctor, but your sound is sounding very low.
I'm audible.
Yes.
The average GCL and IPL thickness was reduced in both dyskidema and dysphalar significantly. As between the mean average GCC complex thickness was significantly reduced in NGO. Walton and al. Reported that GCL and IPL thickness was reduced in optic neuritis associated with MS. Laminar and al. Suggested overall thinning of GCC complex in disease. Conclusion: quantification of RNFL and GCL thickness by OCT provides indirect measure of axonal and neuronal loss in anterior visual pathway. RNFL thickness varies depending on the type of neuropathy. GCC loss is the hallmark of optic neuropathy and should be monitored for early detection and prognosis in non-glaucomatous optic neuropathy patient. OCT can detect and subclinical axonal loss in patients with the normal visual acuity. Therefore, OCT may serve as a fast and economical test to aid in determining the non-glaucomatous optic neuropathy. Furthermore, OCT is useful in distinguishing macular disease from optic neuritis and in monitoring treatment. Multiple studies and clinical observations support the importance of OCT in diagnosis, treatment, and follow-up of optic neuropathy. Thank you.
Thank you, doctor. We now go for the question and answers. No questions? Okay. We now move to our next speaker, Dr.
Thank you.
Priya Dhana. Thank you. Dr. Priya Dhana? Is Dr. Priya Dhana there? Okay. So we go to our next speaker, Dr. Andros Finario. To please switch on the camera, unmute yourself. Dr. Andros, please unmute yourself. Thank you.
Ma'am.
And start the screen sharing. Over to you, doctor.
Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Andrews, you are not audible. So please unmute
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'm sharing the screen, sir. Is it visible, sir?
No.
Someone please help him.
I'm down arrow, share screen option.
Sir, I have clicked that share screen option, sir. It's
But ma'am, not coming in your screen.
1 minute.
Yeah.
Okay, sir. Is it coming? Is it visible now, sir?
No ma'am, अभी तो आई नहीं है.
Sir?
No ma'am. Yeah. Right, so ma'am.
Sir, is it visible now?
Yes ma'am, yes, please slide so. Yes ma'am, first slide.
Morning, everyone. Sir, can I start, sir? Is it
Yes,
visible?
Yes,
Okay,
okay.
Morning, everyone. My topic for today is severe recurrent optic neuritis in children. Think of neuromyelitis optica spectrum disorders. So coming to introduction, neuromyelitis optica spectrum disorder is an inflammatory demyelinating disease of central nervous system, primarily affecting optic nerves and spinal cord. The disease is very rare in children. Overall incidence of NMOSD in pediatric population is said to be 0.05 to 4 per 1 lakh population per year. So it usually it is very rare, and children it is even rare, and children frequently presents as isolated optic neuritis. Hence, usually their first visit will be to an ophthalmologist, and they play an important role in the diagnosis. So sequential optic neuritis with rapid succession or bilateral presentation of optic neuritis means we have to suspect neuromyelitis optica. The disease is often confused with multiple sclerosis. The early discrimination between neuromyelitis optica and multiple sclerosis is important because the two diseases have different treatment regimen. An untreated neuromyelitis optica can cause permanent loss of vision, paralysis, or even death. Hence, the early diagnosis and prompt treatment is crucial. The detection of aquaporin P4 antibodies helps us to reliably distinguish between multiple sclerosis and NMO. Coming to the revised diagnostic criteria, it has divided into two groups. That is, one group with aquaporin P4 IgG antibody positive, and another with negative group. And for the positive group, the diagnostic criteria gives that if there should be one core clinical characteristics to diagnose it as an NMO. If the patient is negative for aquaporin P4 IgG antibody, then there should be two core clinical characteristics, with one characteristic should be either optic neuritis, acute myelitis, or area post-tremor syndrome. And the core clinical characteristics include optic neuritis, acute myelitis, area post-tremor syndrome, acute brainstem syndrome, acute diencephalic clinical syndrome with typical MRI lesions, or symptomatic cerebral syndrome with typical MRI lesions. So coming to the differentiating features between multiple sclerosis and NMO, the age of onset for multiple sclerosis is usually 20 to 40 years, and for NMO, the median age is 39 years. The multiple sclerosis shows a progressive course, and the attack severity will be usually more severe in case of neuromyelitis optica. Optic neuritis is usually unilateral in case of multiple sclerosis, but in NMO, we can get bilateral presentations. And the recovery of the attack will be good in case of multiple sclerosis, whereas it will be poor in cases of neuromyelitis optica, and the recurrence will be more and severe in cases of neuromyelitis optica. And regarding MRI, there will be periventricular white matter lesions in the brain in case of multiple sclerosis, and in spinal cord MRI, you can see short segment peripheral lesions. Whereas in NMO, there is no or non-specific white matter lesions in brain usually seen. Sometimes you can see the hypothalamic corpus callosum and periventricular and brainstem lesions can be seen. And in spinal cord MRI, longitudinal extensive central lesions, that is which involves more than 3 vertebral segments can be seen. So we report a 13-year-old girl who was presented to our OPD outpatient department with sudden painless diminution, bilateral diminution of vision. And visual acuity was PL in both her eyes. And tracing back her medical history, it was found that similar episodes had happened in 8 years and 11 years. And she was treated with methylprednisolone pulse therapy. According to the informant, the vision deteriorated with successive episodes. So distance vision was seen to be PL in both eyes, and pupil was seen dilated and sluggish, and fundus was pale. Pale disc was shown. And MRI brain showed features of optic neuritis and small hyperintense foci in corona radiata and periventricular area, and cervicomedullary junction. And VEP of both eyes showed prolonged P100 latency. Out of strong suspicion for neuromyelitis optica, we have referred the patient to the neurologist, and he sent for NMO IgG assay, aquaporin P4 antibody, and the result was found to be positive, and the diagnosis was confirmed. And the patient was given intravenous methylprednisolone.
Doctor, I could request you to please conclude the session. Thank you, doctor. Do we have any questions? No questions for Dr. Andros? We now move to our next speaker. Thank you, Dr. Andros.
Thank you, ma'am.
I now introduce our next speaker, Dr. Urmila Jaipal. Is Dr. Urmila Jaipal present? We don't have Dr. Urmila, so we'll go to our next speaker, Dr. Deepak Soni. Dr. Deepak Soni is also not present. Dr. Shubhankita Paul.
Yes, am I audible?
Yes, doctor, please on your camera. Yes, over to you, doctor.
Sharing my
Yes.
screen. Good morning, everyone. Myself, Dr. Shubhankita Paul, third year PGT, Shilcha Medical College and Hospital. My today's topic is ophthalmology clinical features of facial nerve palsy patients. No financial interest, And coming to the introduction, facial nerve palsy can have many different causes. It spans across all the races and ages and has significant functional, psychological, social consequences. The facial nerve, that is the seventh cranial nerve, controls the muscles of facial expression, and its damage causes dysfunction of facial expression or the blink response. Blink dysfunction is induced by weakness of the orbicularis oculi. Ophthalmic signs such as lid malposition, exposure, keratopathy, dry eye, EP4 are common. Facial nerve palsy can be divided into central and peripheral. Central palsy is induced by brain disorders like stroke, trauma, brain tumor, and peripheral facial palsy caused by, as is seen in one of the study by Raman, the causes being Bell's palsy, trauma, and Ramsay-Hunt syndrome. The aims and objectives of this study. The purpose of this study is to understand the ophthalmic clinical features and outcome of facial nerve palsy patients who are referred to our outpatient department of ophthalmology for various conditions. Metrics and methods, it is an observational study carried out from June 2019 to 2020. We analyzed 50 eyes from 50 facial nerve palsy patients who are referred to our ophthalmic clinic. The inclusion criteria are patients of ages 15 to 65 years and of either sex presenting with diagnosed facial nerve palsy. Exclusion criteria, patients with palsy involving other cranial nerves are excluded, patients with other ocular diseases and ocular surgeries, and patients refusing consent. Written informed consent taken from the patient, diagnosis, determination of treatments, and follow-up monitoring were conducted by the same team of surgeons for each patient. Clinical history, comprehensive examination, general neurological ophthalmic examinations were carried out. Neurologic examination, assessment of all cranial nerves, ocular movements, facial nerve evaluation, ocular examination consisting of baseline, visual acuity, pupillary reactions, Schumann test evaluation of corneal sensation, and optic disc evaluation. Here are the pictures of two patients showing Bell's palsy. This is a 17-year-old female presented with Bell's palsy and 57-year-old male patient with right facial nerve palsy following CVA. Results: 50 patients studied range in age from 15 to 65 years. The ratio of males to female is 31:19. The study shows Bell's palsy in 26 number of patients, trauma in 13 patients, and CVA 11 patients. Ophthalmology clinical signs and symptoms that we got are legophthalmos in 30 patients, swelling following trauma in 6 patients, corneal epithelial defect 32 patients, corneal opacity 3 patients, conjunctival injection 19, chemosis 3, EP4 in 7 patients, and dry eye in 15 patients. Ophthalmic drops and ointment was prescribed according to symptoms, and taping was conducted in all eyes. 60% of Bell's palsy patients treated with prednisolone alone and acyclovir prednisolone, depending on the pathology, recovered within 5 months. Invasive procedures like temporary traceraphy carried out in 5 patients and permanent traceraphy in 15 patients. 2 patients underwent temporal bone compression. 3 patients developed corneal opacity and severe visual impairment despite surgical intervention and other treatment. At the time of the last follow-up, signs had improved in 75% of patients with legophthalmos, 90% with corneal epithelial defect, and 60% with EP4. Now, the ophthalmic clinical features of facial nerve palsy were mainly legophthalmos and corneal erosions. Prompt referral, early and appropriate intervention from our side prevents serious ophthalmic sequelae like vision loss. Thus, ophthalmologist plays a vital role in the multidisciplinary team involved in the evaluation and rehabilitation of these patients. Thank you.
Yeah, so that was a good overview of facial nerve palsy, but you had a lot of Bell's palsy. Did you try to find out the cause of these Bell's palsy, like maybe some kind of a viral infection or some other associated etiologies?
Sir, most of them are having that prodromal fever, and also maybe it's because of viral prodromal.
So the etiologies would have been better, and so you can basically focus your treatment if you have an etiology. And secondly, did you see how many were upper motor neuron or lower motor neuron facial palsies? But that also gives a clue of what you're dealing with when you're dealing with these situations.
Yes, in upper motor neuron, sir, we may also get other cranial nerves involvement, but here we excluded that, so we have taken only the lower motor neuron involvement only. But your patients had CVA also, isn't it? Your cerebrovascular accidents and all, and traumatic Yes,
cases. So,
yes,
how did you do maybe brain imaging in all of these patients?
No, not all patients, sir. In trauma patients, we did that CT, and in severe patients too.
And how was the outcome in these 4 categories which you had, like Bell's, traumatic, CVA, the one you had?
Sir, typically Bell's palsy, sir, most of them recover has spontaneous recovery, and with prednisolone alone. And sir, in CGA patients, few severe patients, we have to go for permanent tarsorrhaphy.
No more questions? Okay, so we move. Thank you, Dr. Subhankrita. Now we move to our next speaker, Dr. Biswaranjan Jaina. Is she present? Okay, we move to our next speaker, Dr. Vaibhav Nagpal. Dr. Vaibhav? Yes, please unmute yourself and start the screen sharing.
I just start. Are my slides visible?
Yes, doctor.
Good morning, everyone. So, yeah, can I start now?
Yes, doctor.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank AIOS for this opportunity. I'll be presenting my case titled A Rare Case of Bilateral Third Nerve Palsy. I have no financial interests. The patient presented to us, a 24-year-old male resident of Delhi, presented to us with drooping of both the upper eyelids since 1 month, which increased in severity. The patient also has history of fever since 1 year with a waxing and a waning course. Also, the patient had drooping of both the upper eyelids since 1 month. It was associated with limitation of movements in both the eyes and was initially associated with diplopia. The patient also gave history of few episodes of vomiting and headache. Patient also gave history of hypersomnia. There is no history of diurnal variation in severity of ptosis or movement limitation, no history of trauma, decrease of vision or similar complaints, no history of weakness in any other part of the body. On general examination, the patient was conscious, cooperative, and oriented. The neurological examination revealed no sensory or motor deficit except for the ocular muscles. Deep tendon reflexes were normal and nuchal rigidity was present. On ocular examination, the patient had a vision of 6/9 in both the eyes, with a chin lift and a frontalis overaction, with no facial asymmetry. The patient had a severe ptosis with poor LPS action and absent Bell's phenomena. The patient had exotropia and hypotropia in both the eyes. Both the eyes had limitation in all the gazes except for the abduction and encyclotorsion seen on slit lamp. The patient had a mid-dilated 7 mm non-reacting pupil and the fundus was normal. Hematological examinations revealed a raised ESR of 48, rest being normal, a Mantoux test of 15 into 13 mm after 48 hours of inoculation with a normal chest X-ray. Cerebrospinal fluid analysis revealed a cell count of 25 cells per millimeter cube with 60% lymphocytes and 40% polymorphs with a glucose level of 6 mg per deciliter, protein being 280 mg per dl. The MRI revealed bilateral, lateral, third and fourth ventricle dilation, suggestive of a communicating hydrocephalus. Here, in this MRI, we can see multiple ring-enhancing lesions in the both cerebral hemispheres and also in the other cerebral hemispheres. You can also see exudate in the basal cistern in the perimesencephalic areas. All these findings suggested of bilateral third nerve palsy with tubercular meningitis with hydrocephalus. The patient was started on antitubercular treatment with steroids. The symptoms of headache, fever, and vomiting started resolving, and the patient is being followed up for further management. Atraumatic, isolated bilateral third nerve palsy could be because of central or peripheral causes. Central being midbrain stroke, mesencephalic lesion, neurosarcoidosis, and peripheral being diabetes, vasculitis, and infections. Third nerve palsy assessment involves detailed neurological examination with special importance to pupillary involvement. Whenever a patient has isolated third nerve palsy with bilateral pupillary involvement, we should think of we should localize it to the two areas, the mesencephalon or the subarachnoid space. Here in this anatomical diagram, which we can see this is the area where the two third nerves leave the midbrain. And this is the clinical MRI picture. We can see the exudates in the perimesencephalic areas, suggestive of the etiology and the anatomical correlation. Pupil involving third nerve palsy demands urgent CNS imaging to rule out any compressive cause like an aneurysm or a tumor. After a compressive cause is ruled out, inflammatory pathology should be considered as a causative condition. Concluding, tuberculosis is one of the most common infectious disease in developing nations like India. Imaging is a must in a young patient with isolated bilateral third nerve palsy. Anatomical localization and clinical correlation is very important in cranial nerve palsy. Thank you.
So that was a good case. Did you basically, what was it, like nuclear third nerve or an intranuclear third nerve?
Sir, a nuclear third nerve would have other associated features because there are very important structures around the nucleus, right? Red nucleus and the cerebral peduncle. So these findings on the neurological examination, there was no tremors or ataxia or any paralysis. So most probably whenever there is isolated third nerve palsy, we should think of a subarachnoid space, which we saw in the anatomical correlation around the midbrain as the nerves were leaving. So there were the exudates, and most probably because of the inflammation and direct involvement of the subarachnoid space and the pial vessels were involved. So most probably because, and the patient also had hypersomnia, suggestive of the inflammation of the midbrain area leading to those symptoms.
So did you, this patient had problems since 1 year, isn't it?
He had on and off fever, sir.
On and off fever, the eye problems, the eye problems.
So can you repeat, sir?
The ocular problem.
Yes, sir. Ocular problems he developed since 1 month, sir.
1 month. Okay, okay. So did you check for the vestibulo-ocular reflex?
Sir, the patient was was not cooperative enough to check
you
for.
Have to turn his head. That's all, left and right.
Yes,
just for the doll's eye reflex.
So, but there was we tried that, but sir, we could not appreciate because of the movement limitations, sir. The only abduction was possible. So
in these cases, if you have a VOR, probably that will give you a clue what where the lesion is, because even if you have limitation and a VOR is positive, probably those are the cases where the intranuclear pathway is not involved. Anyway, that's nice. But how do you explain the pupillary dilatation in this case then bilateral?
Sir, as the pupillary fibers are in the periphery of the lesions, and the nerves leave in the subarachnoid space from the midbrain, so there were exudates, and so the pial vessels would be inflamed, and that will lead to ischemia and of the pial vessels which supply the pupillary fibers. That will explain the pupillary involvement, sir.
So patient recovered ultimately. What happened?
No, sir. We tried to contact the patient, but actually, because of the hydrocephalus, the patient couldn't be saved, sir. Thank you, sir.
So thank you, Dr. Weber. We have Dr. Dhanapriya. So I now call upon our next speaker, Dr. Dhanapriya, to please switch on the camera, unmute her mic. Dr. Dhanapriya?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Please start.
Yes, sir. 1 second.
Doctor, please share your screen.
Yes, ma'am. 1 second, ma'am. I'm not able to present. Yes.
Okay. We have the arrow screen below, share screen.
Yes, ma'am. Can I present it later? Few minutes, ma'am. I'm not able to share my presentation.
Okay. I'll just see if we have any other speaker present.
சொன்னாங்க போய் கிடக்கு நான் அந்த சமைக்கிறாங்க யாராவது பக்கத்துல சமைச்சா ஒரு மாதிரி அப்படின்னு நான் வாரம் ஆனா எடுத்து போகணும் தரம் பட்டாலும் பரவாயில்ல அப்படின்னு நான் ஒண்ணும் பண்ணிட்டு இதெல்லாம் இந்த வேலை
Hello, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Okay.
Sorry for the delay, sir. I'll be presenting this topic, expect the unexpected. So we know the anti-neoplastic drugs, which have become the most important element in cancer management. So these agents, they usually act by targeting the cell division machinery. So there are many ocular side effects because of these chemotherapeutic agents. There is a need for the ophthalmologist and the oncologist for an early detection and prevent detection of these complications, so that they can prevent the sight-threatening complications of these drugs. So we had reported 2 cases. One was a 36-year-old female diagnosed with a CA breast. She had a complaint of defective vision following the initiation of chemotherapy with injection docetaxel, which was the first cycle given to her. There were no associated comorbidities for her. Her best corrective visual acuity were just perception of light. But there was a record of vision of 6/6 vision for her before the drug therapy. On bedside examination of both the eyes showed normal anterior segment and fundus examination. The second case was a 63-year-old female diagnosed with CA lung. She was in stage 4. She complained of defective vision with following the initiation of chemotherapy with injection cisplatin. And she also had no other associated comorbidities. Her best corrected visual acuity in right eye was perception of light and left eye was 3/60. Her pre-drug visual acuity, but it was recorded 1 year back, was a 6/9 in both eyes, with 6/9 in both eyes. And except for a minimal cataractus changes. The other findings were normal. So the similarities between these cases were both cases presented to us within 7 days of initiation of chemotherapy. They were diagnosed as a case of toxic optic neuropathy post-chemotherapy. So we plan to start them on tablet prednisolone, 1 milligram per kilogram, following discontinuation of the chemotherapy. So the bedside visual acuity showed no improvement, but owing to the poor general condition and we are not able to mobilize the patient from the oncology ward to us, and we failed to record the video record her vision post steroid therapy. So on coming to the drug docetaxel, it was an anti-neoplastic agent. So it acts by inhibiting the cell division. The ocular side effects documented for docetaxel, the toxic optic neuropathy which was caused by the docetaxel was rarely reported, causing constriction of visual fields and loss of visual acuity and loss of color vision. The other adverse effects were bilateral cystoid macular edema, epiphora, and maculopathy. Cisplatin is another platinum-based chemotherapy drug. It was used for various carcinomas, lymphomas, and germ cell tumors. It also acts by inhibiting the DNA synthesis and fragmentation, affecting the cell division. So the ocular side effects of cisplatin were optic neuritis, cortical blindness, retinal artery occlusion, severe vascular ischemia, retinal neovascularization. So there are also retinal toxicity with cisplatin. So the limitations of in our case report where we are non-availability of data regarding the pre-drug visual acuity and also inadequate follow-up of the patients because of the general condition. So I conclude that there should be a proper ophthalmic assessment prior to the initiation of the chemotherapeutic agents, and also there should be close ophthalmic monitoring immediately in the first initiation of the chemotherapy. An immediate intervention by discontinuation of the current chemotherapeutic agent and immediately starting the patients on steroid, we can stop the sight-threatening complications. Thank you.
So if no other speaker is there, we can conclude the session.
We don't have any questions for Dr. Dhanapriya.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
So we have no other speakers present.
We have, so there are 3 presenting authors who are absent. Is it right? Paper
Yes. Yes, that's correct.
2127 and 2165.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I now conclude the session. Thank you, doctors, for your informative presentation, and judges.
Thank you.